thinking about the Nash and Nash solution concept again, one question a lot of people ask, well, is it reasonable to assume that if a firm disagrees with another, that all other contracts remain the same? Not just those contracts for other parties, but also the other contracts that I or J may be involved with. And the answer is, well, that's sort of a nice open question. One of the reasons why Nash and Nash has been used in applied work is because this object here is a counterfactual, which is a fairly transparent thing to compute and fairly tractable and fairly easy to do. There are more complicated bargaining solution concepts. I don't want to say more complicated. There are different bargaining solution concepts that take different stances on what this represents. An open question is when we sort of move to applied work, can that model be distinguishable from this model? Because the Nash and Nash bargaining model, if you think about it, is fairly flexible once you move to asymmetric bargaining weights or even pair-specific bargaining weights. And one of the tests of whether Nash and Nash is reasonable or not, it's let's actually examine a contract that exists in the data, and let's see whether the Nash and Nash model would predict there actually to be negative gains for trade given these disagreement points. The answer is yes, and we believe that we've computed the objects going into these profit functions correctly, then that might be evidence to suggest that Nash and Nash isn't correct and we want to move to something else. But things to keep in mind. Right? And I'm going to sort of take this model as given and move forward to describe the applied papers. But understand this is not by any means, and I really hope not, the end of the road. Right? That there is a lot of room for alternative solution concepts that build on or replace or are adapted to the setting or the institution that you're thinking about. Okay, so that's sort of one quick digression. But let's move back to Grennan. This is where I was at. Let's recall that Matt is trying to simulate what would happen in the medical device or stent industry if manufacturers were required to negotiate a single uniform price across all hospitals. Okay? And here is some of the intuition from the older theory literature. Yes? Question?
To make sure uniform price means that all the stents of the same type, which is simple metal or not, should have the same price?
No, so that's a great question. The question is, what do I mean by uniform pricing? Uniform pricing means the same model has to be sold at the same price to all hospitals. But there could be price variation across stents, even within type or category. Okay. All right, so here is sort of the approach. I'm going to do every paper kind of like this, so there's going to be some similarities. Let's get used to this sort of timing, or rather this kind of slide. Here's what Matt's going to do. He's going to specify and estimate the following model, the data generating process. There's going to be a demand and a supply side stage. On the demand side, he's going to assume that there are patient combination with doctor preferences over what stent is used. So what happens is there's going to be a hospital. Consumers arrive exogenously with some sort of coronary heart disease, some reason they need a stent. And the hospital's physician that the consumer gets assigned to in combination with the consumer chooses the best stent. And let's say that there's, let's call it U1, U2, U3, that this hospital contracts with. Among these stents, the hospital, or the physician, the consumer choose the best stent among the set of products the hospital offers. Okay? So far, so good? All right. The reason we're going to spend some time on the demand system is because it's going to tell us what happens to stent utilization patterns within a hospital if the choice set was different. If the hospital dropped stent 2, or if it added stent 3. Okay? It's also going to provide price elasticities. How sensitive is demand within a hospital to the negotiated price, let's say P1 and P2, that each stent manufacturer charge? If you think about it, these price elasticities are also going to inform the determination of these wholesale prices. Okay. Yes?
Maybe you referred to it in the previous lecture, which unfortunately I missed, but what's
Of course.
the intuition about what's the intuition why uniform prices would make things way better?
So some of the, I guess, there's an older theory piece, I guess Holmes, if preferences for stents are vertical, and that everybody agrees, let's say stent A is better than stent B, but right now what's going on is stent A is charging a different price for one hospital versus another, by forcing everybody to, by combining all hospitals together, so one sort of single market, it now might actually intensify price competition among the stent manufacturers, as opposed to if the hospitals were divided up and I mean, I think
It's
that
the
would-
hospitals who are charging, not the manufacturers of the,
I'm sorry, did I meant the manufacturers
yeah,
charging different prices across hospitals.
different prices across hospitals.
Correct.
Ah,
Correct.
I see. Okay.
For the same exact product.
Okay.
So it could make
They are
things
charging
worse.
different prices, different hospitals.
Yes.
It's not that they are offering it at different prices. I mean, you could have different manufacturers offering things at different prices.
That is also the case, but we're not going to impose uniform pricing across manufacturers.
They could have good economic reasons.
Yes. But I'm not talking, yes. So the,
So you're talking about the same manufacturer asking different prices, different hospitals.
correct. So the question, again, to clarify what we mean by uniform pricing here is, even though it's not depicted in this diagram, there are other hospitals in the market. We're going to assume in this paper that these hospitals do not compete with one another for patients, and that stent manufacturers can charge different prices to different hospitals. And one of the reasons why we might think uniform pricing might occur is if hospitals could band together and negotiate prices jointly as part of some group purchasing organization. And one idea is, well, maybe by banding together, they could reduce the negotiated price. That's sort of more of a bargaining sort of story as well. So that's another reason why uniform pricing could lead to reduced prices.
Just as an order of magnitude, those prices are about how much per stent?
Oh.
To get an idea?
Oh, absolutely.
And the cost is what? Just to get a rough idea where we are.
So costs will come to. The cost is, he does not observe directly as industry estimates, but just to preview things on the order of
Orders of magnitude.
$100 to $400 per device, let's say. And they're being sold on average, one category of stents about $1,000 each, and another category about $2,500 on average.
Okay.
So that's some order of magnitudes here, per device, per stent.
And we know the copay? Is there a copay?
So the question is, do we know the copay or coinsurance? We do not here. And we'll get to the demand system and show you exactly what's being assumed there. Okay. Any other questions, by the way? So, okay. So we're going to estimate a demand system that's going to tell us both preference, basically inform how doctors and consumers choose the best stent for a given case. It's going to also inform the welfare and profits for manufacturers. This is going to be important when we move to the bargaining stage. Firms are going to be assumed, or we're going to assume that firms negotiate these prices via this Nash and Nash bargaining solution concept. Again, as I mentioned, hospitals are assumed to be independent. There are no contrasting externalities across hospitals, and that's also going to be supported by the fact that there are constant marginal costs to produce these stents. There are no increasing or decreasing returns.
In this setting, we don't need
Right.
to consider insurers.
So the question is, do we consider insurers? It's going to be abstracted away here, and perhaps once I go through the demand system, we can come back and ask ourselves, how would estimates be affected if we tried to incorporate them, or how can we interpret these estimates in light of the fact that we're not using, we're not modeling insurers explicitly. Okay. We're going to assume, and this is important when we employ these bargaining models, we're going to assume something about the objectives that are being maximized. Whereas it's maybe fairly straightforward to assume manufacturers maximize profits, we're going to be assuming that hospitals are maximizing some measure of patient-physician welfare, right? That they're not profit maximizing, but they're welfare maximizing. With this model, we're going to try to attempt to pair it with the data to estimate a few objects, which include primitives governing demand, the marginal costs for these stents that are unobserved, and some measure of bargaining power. You want to think of this as the Nash bargaining weight or Nash bargaining power in the Nash bargaining problem. Okay? And then with this machinery, we're going to simulate prices for stents under some uniform pricing counterfactual, which I'll be more explicit to later about.
I'm assuming that hospitals set patient welfare as the objective. explicitly legally for-profit entities and are very profitable in fact.
That's a great question. It's a modeling device here.
That's true, but there are a lot that are.
It's a nonprofit. So it's a modeling convention here employed by this paper and another. What it allows for is to abstract away from sort of another layer of competition here. Because if we think that hospitals are maximizing profits, there are other objects one would have to estimate or observe in order to get a handle on that. I know that may not be satisfying, and we're going to maybe talk about, well, what happens to the believability of estimates or counterfactuals if the objective were misspecified. But just, given sort of the data availability, that's the working assumption. All right, so let me start with a demand system. So we tell you a little bit about the richness that he accounts for and what's missing, perhaps, and then we'll talk about the supply side. Okay? So Matt's going to assume that in a given month, T, hospital H has access to some set of stents, cursive J, HT, which in this case is stents offered by stents 1 and 2. He's going to specify the utility for Dr. I providing stent J at hospital H time T to a given patient with the following functional form. There's going to be some hospital stent specific effect, right, which is going to absorb, if you think about it, hospital stent preference, most of the time invariant hospital stent preferences. There's going to be some price term here. Maybe a more expensive stent to a hospital is going to be used less. Perhaps we believe physicians may not be price sensitive because they don't see it, but maybe hospitals can implement indirect cost control measures. Perhaps. Let's see what the data says. There's going to be other sort of covariates we're going to include. One of the covariates is a dummy for whether this is pre or post this negative academic article on the performance of drug-eluting stents, and some demand shock, that's hospital stent time specific, and some IAD logit term that's patient or specific. It's essentially a nested logit model between choosing a stent versus some alternative procedure, and then within the stent category, is it a drug-eluting or bare metal stent to capture more realistic substitution patterns. Because the idea is physicians make that kind of tree, use that decision process when choosing the best treatment. Okay. So there's a lot embedded in estimating this demand system, which I'm going to gloss over. One of the neat things about it is that it recovers this hospital stent time-specific unobservable shock using this Berry-Levinson-Pecos inversion, but instead of assuming that this object is uncorrelated with a vector of instruments, it's going to assume that the innovation in this demand shock is going to be uncorrelated. So it's going to impose some process on the evolution of that and just assume somewhat, serially correlated, but there's some innovation that's not anticipated by, let's say, firms when setting prices the month before. Okay? And this is fundamentally a timing assumption. The idea here is that prices are negotiated for long-term contracts, and so maybe it's not unreasonable that when prices are determined, they don't anticipate, demand shocks in future months. Okay? And that's going to give us an ability to identify these coefficients. Yeah.
So for example, so here one physician works in hospital H, and next year they went from H to H prime, and then will this create some additional correlation between across hospitals, across time, or some additional observed?
So the question is whether the movement of physicians across hospitals, and let's say physicians have stable preferences, let's say, will induce some correlation in demand shocks across hospitals. So that's an interesting question. In this model, if you think the physician composition in a hospital changes over time, and it's not really quite explicit there, it would be probably soaked up in these shock terms here. And I don't think anything is being imposed in sort of the relationship of these demand shocks across hospitals. Really what's being leveraged is within hospital over time evolution. So as long as that's not violated, I think this is fine. But he's not leveraging. He's not sort of explicitly modeling the physician. He doesn't have data on who was a physician at a hospital that prescribed this stent.
Like the hospital
The question is, yes, the question is does the hospital sort of a representative or aggregates up?
Yeah,
That's correct, yes. Yes.
Don't we need for the Nash and Nash to assume that everybody is contracting with everybody? And is it reasonable here?
So the question is, does a Nash and Nash solution assume everybody contracts with everybody? Many papers use the Nash and Nash solution concept to govern the surplus division for an observed set of contracts. So in this case, in the data, if we see a hospital contract with a subset of contracting partners, a necessary condition for the price to satisfy Nash and Nash is that at least the observed contracts will satisfy that bargain. There is some variation as to whether or not information on unformed contracts, like in Kate Ho's paper that Mike talked about, is used. But here he's not using that
We
information.
actually don't have to have this assumption.
No, I'm sorry. So to go back, yes, you don't need to assume that everybody contracts with everybody. You can just assume that for a given set of observed contracts, prices satisfy Nash, the Nash and Nash solution. Yes.
You said that the preference among stents is essentially universal, right? Everybody prefers stent A to stent B, let's say. Or did I get that wrong?
Oh, no, so that was an example. But here in this setting, it's not going to be the case that everybody prefers the same stent.
Okay, so that given stents are not to us. Different doctors may have different populations of patients. Like one is expert in some cardiac condition A, for which maybe stent A is the best. Somebody else is expert in condition B, for which stent B is best. Now, the only place where I enters is in the error term in your equation, which it seems to miss some population. So different doctors may differ not just in the error, but in something else. And it's not in your equation.
So the question is, where does the model capture physician preferences?
Physician having access, different populations coming
Yes.
to different physicians. Or, somebody who's like chair of the department or head of the department is very famous and gets, cases that have one
Right.
type, and somebody else that gets, very different cases with very different populations.
So in this particular demand model, I believe that Matt would say that if the physician composition of a hospital is stable over time, that would be absorbed here. That we're now looking at, okay, this hospital has 3 physicians, each with their own sets of patients and preferences. They each have their different, share of stent A or stent B that they use, but every month the hospital is using the share of stent A versus stent B, so there's some amalgamation of preferences across these physicians that's being modeled here. But if there is any time varying component, it's really going to be coming in these parts here. But absolutely, this model is trying to summarize a lot of richness in the world. Any questions on this? Okay, so if you estimate this demand system, it then allows you to then move to the bargaining stage. Okay? As I mentioned before, for a given set of contracts that a hospital signs, Matt is going to assume that the prices are determined via this expression here, where you have here product J's profits for a given manufacturer. Product J's profits, and you have what's called the added value to a hospital. Let's focus on this term first. This is essentially going to be what is the quantity demanded for that stent at that hospital, given a vector of prices that have been negotiated at that hospital. Right? There are no externalities across hospitals, so these are just a vector of that hospital's prices, times the margins made on that product, where C is the marginal cost. Okay, weighted to some stent J times specific bargaining parameter that may vary according to the hospital. And now we have this added value term.
You're allowing for the possibility that the cost of the stent might depend on the hospital.
So in this paper, as written, it looks fairly general. That's no longer, that's not going to hold very long. Indeed, it's not going to hold as soon as we get to this bullet point, where Matt is going to assume that the marginal cost of a stent is simply a function of what kind of stent is it. Is it a bare metal stent, in which case it's gamma BMS, or is it a drug-eluting stent, gamma DES? There's no dependence, correct. And I'll come to that in terms of identification because he's going to try to allow for quite a bit of flexibility here it limits the extent to which we can allow for flexibility here, particularly in that he doesn't have information on this. He's going to try to simultaneously estimate components that go into both of these parameters. Okay. Let's go back to the hospital added value. As I mentioned before, well, first, under Nash and Nash, when a hospital disagrees with a stent J, little j, he just removes that stent, little j, from his set of products that he's offering to his physicians and customers. And we're looking at, well, what's the change in the hospital's objective if you remove stent j? What is the hospital's objective? As I mentioned before, we're going to assume that the hospital maximizes the welfare of its physician/patients. Okay. This is consistent with a model where hospitals are final consumers, maximize patient doctor utility. A similar assumption is used by a paper, as I alluded to before, Garasanker and Nouveau and Town, modeling hospital mergers, where they assume that an insurer, particularly in the self-insured commercial market of the US, maximizes its employer's welfare, right? That its incentives are aligned with the employer, and therefore, as opposed to thinking of it as profit maximizing, really what it's doing is try to make its employers as happy as possible, because they just get paid an administration fee, really, that they're not actually incurring the true costs of insurance. But there are other ways of motivating that assumption. All right. Okay, so we have costs, we have where hospital added value comes from, and now we're going to think about the bargaining parameters. What Matt's going to assume is that these bargaining parameters have this following form, where there's some time-varying component nu, which is somewhat random over time, that multiplies some constant stent hospital-specific term, beta. Okay? So that a given stent and a given hospital have essentially sort of some bargaining power between the two of them that evolves kind of noisily around that over time. It evolves. Right? So far, so good? Yes?
So if I'm a doctor and I think that for a particular patient, this bare metal stent would be better than that one, but my hospital doesn't contract with that negotiator, or that provider, I can't install that stent?
So the question is, can a doctor prescribe a stent that is not offered by the hospital he's at? And the answer is yes, that's an assumption being made here.
Okay, but is that, as an institutional retail, the medical device market, is that accurate? Am I going to have to go to another hospital if I really want to install a particular stent for a particular patient?
I can't speak to that. I don't know. I mean, if you have very strong preferences, one might say that that doctor would convince the hospital to sort of stock it, right?
Or if the doctor has admitting privileges across hospitals,
He might go to her. That's how I imagine that issue would be resolved. Okay. So let's take this bargaining equation. Let's take the first order condition. And what Matt's going to do is rewrite it as the following. Okay. He's going to say that the negotiated price at a given time period between stent J and hospital H has the following form, where it's the marginal cost of the stent plus some term that's going to be weighted by this bargaining parameter. Okay. So the idea is, well, product J captures its marginal cost plus some share equal to its bargaining weight of the hospital's gains from trade, right? This object here is the added value. You scale it by the total number of people using that stent. That's sort of a per patient model of how much the hospital benefits from having this additional stent in its choice set. But there's this term here which controls for the fact that when the stent manufacturer increases or changes its price, it may affect the quantity utilized. Okay? So this, as he calls it, a correction term, but it's really, you want to think of it as, so, you know, what's the effect on quantity demanded as I increase my price. Okay? When the hospital has no bargaining power, so its B term is 0, this is the same as the standard Bertrand-Nash pricing condition. Manufacturers compete with other manufacturers and simultaneously set prices, given the set of products that are offered at the hospital. Okay. What he does is takes this expression that comes from the theory, rewrites it as follows, where he says, all right, well, if you believe the way I parameterize the bargaining power, you got this log beta JH term, you got this log nu term, that's time varying, you have this G term, which is a function only of observables and parameters to estimate. Which means then that this log nu term is a function of data and the parameters, and we can then form a bunch of moments and estimate those parameters via GMM. Okay. Now, how do we think of identification? How is it that Matt's able to separately identify marginal costs from these bargaining parameters? All right, I'll come back to the instrument, but here's a bit of intuition. He's going to say that costs are identified separately from beta because one is additive and one is a function of added value. Another way of thinking about it is when you look within a hospital stent, okay, so over time you see a hospital negotiating with a given stent and there's some price variation over time. Well, if there's any correlation with those price movements and the differences in added value of that stent to the hospital, it's going to say that there should be some weight being placed on that in the price term. Right? That this beta JH, this can't be 0. Okay? So within hospital stent over time, you're getting some sort of mean bargaining weight that the hospital has because basically, or the stent manufacturer has because the stent manufacturer captures a little bit of what the hospital gains. However, now we can look across all stents that are bare metal or all stents that are drug eluting across hospitals. Any sort of common price level shift can be absorbed into this gamma term here. Okay. And you can sort of see that when you look at this equation here. If this was time varying, or as well as hospital varying, you would have a much harder time making that argument. And you may not be able to separately tease them apart. Okay.
Like basically the bargaining parameters here are residual stuff that explains different prices by reasons that are not in the model. But in reality, like the way at least I think about bargaining parameters are like something a little bit more fixed. It's like the power that the individual has in the particular negotiation. So how do we relate both things? Like how do we understand this variation in bargaining parameters in the context of this model or the context of this market?
That's a great question. So I believe, apologies if I rephrase it incorrectly, but if we think of the bargaining parameter in these models as residual, capturing things that are outside the model, what's the interpretation that we should give to it if we're going to try to match it to, what's actually happening in reality? I think that's a sort of a deeper question that I think ongoing work is trying to explore, particularly some of Matt's later work. So what you can think of here is, okay, let's document the dispersion in this residual. And then later, let's see if we can add things to the model that help reduce that sort of the explanatory power of the residual, or increase the explanatory power of the model, right? And perhaps by observing what it's correlated with, we'll know what other objects we might want to condition on. For example, maybe the identity of the negotiator. Or I think your point about the bargaining parameter being a residual of the model is apt, and it also highlights the importance of really believing that we have other objects that go into this model, the importance of having them correct. In particular, the disagreement point. If you have a misspecified disagreement point and the true disagreement is something else, that's going to be soaked up into the bargaining parameter as well. So one fear might be that there's something that's not right about the model that's being soaked up. But let's say the model was correctly specified and correctly estimated, then, well, the variation there is something that we should, I guess, as applied researchers, explore more. Yes. Okay. I'll come to that. There's actually a nice, let me just jump to that. I'm going to go to the results. One of the results he does is sort of give you a histogram of the dispersion of these bargaining abilities. Okay. He's going to find there's actually quite some dispersion. Right? That there isn't going to be the case that the manufacturer always gets across all hospitals the same share of the gains, and that there's some notion in which, I believe it's written that the manufacturer gets really only a third of the surplus on average. Okay, but there's still time variation within a hospital over time for the same manufacturer as well as across hospitals. Okay, and again, I'm just sort of teasing some of his later work. He's actually going to try to sort of find things that go into this. And I think Like Ali has some work that you can parameterize the bargaining parameter as a function of observables and see whether those observables have explanatory power as well. Some estimates of what's called the added value. Here is basically an object that maths can call added value, which is the price paid for the stent, plus on top of it, what the hospital benefits above its disagreement point. So it's basically saying, well, hospitals are paying on average maybe $1,000 per bare metal stent. Well, they're actually valuing that stent by significantly more than just the price they're paying. Okay? That they are capturing quite a bit of the surplus. Okay? So you realize that hospitals are capturing quite a bit of surplus. And I didn't show you is that in the demand system we've estimated, there doesn't seem to be quite a bit of price sensitivity here. Physicians kind of have stable preferences that don't respond to price variation. So then it implies that if we believe that manufacturers are making take it or leave it offers to hospitals, like it's Nash per trend pricing, the only way to rationalize those two outcomes of the model is to estimate very negative marginal costs. Sorry, not this. What am I here? Yes, very negative marginal costs. Right? Because if you have a Bertrand-Nash model of price setting, you're going to look at the elasticities. Demand looks fairly inelastic, high markups. Well, you know what the price charge is about $1,000. So to rationalize that, you have very negative marginal costs. With a more flexible bargaining model, which says, no, wait, hold on a second. These guys can't make take or leave offers. Really, the hospital's pushing back and capturing a fair share of its surplus. You're now obtaining marginal cost estimates, which Matt's going to argue are more reasonable, in that at least they're positive. But secondly, they fall close to what he's obtaining from industry experts. Okay, these are fairly wide ranges, but you know, you get something closer than that over there. Yes, question?
If you try to estimate bargaining power of each hospital versus each manufacturer from characteristics of the hospital and the manufacturer, and you try to compare that with the estimate you get here, what would happen?
So the question is, if you include in this Nash bargaining parameter characteristics of the manufacturer and
I don't know if to
Stent?
include, but like separately to try to estimate, try to say what would you expect the bargaining power of different actors to be? So maybe a larger hospital has more bargaining power, I don't know, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And try to estimate it separately. And then compare with the results you get here. Like what, are the bargaining powers we estimate here reasonable with respect to this other estimation, or is this other estimation is just you can do it? Which I would say.
I think this particular model, I'm just sort of talking through it, if the characteristics that we're thinking about are time invariant, you might think they're absorbed into this component here. In which case we can explore these recovered betas and how they correlate with these covariates later as sort of an exercise one could do, which I don't believe he's done here. As I mentioned, one of Ali's early, well, from the papers I'll talk about, you might think of parameterizing these bargaining parameters as a function of the size of the firm, or whether there's integration or not, and absolutely, and that's what's been done, particularly when you don't have some time varying component here. So if you think this is stationary but a function of observable characteristics if you don't want to assume this structure, but assume that there's some time varying characteristics that the bargaining power depends on, and you see those characteristics, then perhaps you want to go that route. But that's not what's done here. Yes?
Thinking a little bit better, I was
Sure.
clear about how you evaluate the benefit for the hospital from giving a given stent to a given patient. Obviously, it depends on the welfare of the patient from the stent. How do you evaluate this?
So the question is, how do you evaluate the welfare
Yeah.
gain from a...
For a hospital from giving stent J to a patient.
That's a...
How do you do that?
I'll perhaps try to answer that question based on how this paper does it,
Sure.
following
Yes.
the literature. This is not this paper, this is following the literature, where how these discrete choice demand models work is we look at market shares of a given stent within a hospital, and we're going to try to rationalize those market shares as coming from some underlying primitives. We typically, let's say the utility function is specified as follows. Okay? And so if there's price here, then we can sort of compute, well, the differences in utility when you have a choice set this big or a choice set that big, as we look at the difference of the utility measures divided by this coefficient, you translate it into dollar terms. There are limitations of that approach, which sort of is not specific to this paper, but that's what's essentially being done here. We're putting a lot of weight on this demand system in terms of being able to infer the welfare gains. Mike? I don't know if that's fair, but yeah.
I have a question about your question.
I
So-
should say that I know close to nothing about the third world. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
I'm missing some standard convention in the case.
So I guess it could be about two questions. One is, given the data that they have, how much can you learn? And I guess there's no micro data at the patient level. So like you could imagine a data set where you have lots of patients had their medical records and trying to predict what stent was used. That's one issue here. And I guess the other issue is the actual interaction here is very complicated because you have the patient, and you have the doctor, and you have a hospital trying to potentially influence the patient. And so there's some very complicated interaction that's going on that's determining observed demand. And so I wasn't sure which of these two you were wondering about, or both, or
Both.
okay, okay.
But that's, I mean, yeah.
To what extent do you think that the low price sensitivity is due by the fact that you are missing, or the paper is missing, the insurance information like
The
the out-of-pocket protection for the patient, and also that the paper is missing like the stage where the patient chooses the hospital. Like you are
Yeah.
assuming that the patients arrive
So I believe the question is, to what extent do we believe that a low estimated price sensitivity may be coming from those components? So I would say that the issues that you're raising would be a way of interpreting the fact that we see a low price sensitivity. The fact that we see demand not responsive to price changes at the hospital level is consistent with a model in which consumers do not, and their physicians do not actually observe those prices when choosing the best stent. Right? And that's a way to understand why is it that we're estimating something very low. The question then becomes, well, is it fair to think of this as a structural parameter that's invariant when we, let's say, run counterfactuals? And whether, let's say, a hospital with more effective cost control measures or different incentive schemes can affect that. And that's outside the scope of this analysis, but definitely something that actually many papers have thought about it and looked at. Not in the context of this type of modeling exercise, but just as a more general health economics question. Okay. All right, so these are some of the estimates I went through. Let's talk about the counterfactual implementation. What does he do to impose uniform pricing? Well, one of the main counterfactuals is, let's assume now the hospitals can band together as part of a, let's say, a GPO, group purchasing organization, and negotiate jointly over all stents. So for every stent J now, each hospital sort of maximizes, each stent considers what are the profits he gets from all hospitals in the market. And hospitals are sort of aggregating across all of them their welfare benefits from having this stent. Okay? One of the questions here is, what do we assume about the new bargaining parameter that the hospitals now get? Right, remember I told you that these bargaining parameters are going to have some variation across hospitals and across stent manufacturers. Is it reasonable to assume that they all get the same one? Is it the average, the mean, the max? He's going to assume actually those three, 0, average, or the max of the bargaining parameters, and see what happens. However, the manufacturer, remember that there's variation in this across hospitals. He's going to assume that the manufacturer gets the average across all of the hospitals that it negotiates with. Without more information about what goes into it, it's perhaps a little difficult to evaluate the reasonableness of those assumptions, but at least we can sort of explore somewhat the space of of potential outcomes. Okay. So here's when you find a bunch of things going on here. What I want to focus on is just what happens to prices. So on average, as I showed before, bare metal stents get about $1,000 per stent, $2,500 for drug-eluting stents on average. If you look at a model where all hospitals now basically get no bargaining weight, we're going to see that prices jump up almost double for bare metal stents. Right? This is where you have uniform pricing, but manufacturers can make take it or leave it offers. Right? That's not great. What happens if hospitals get the average of the bargaining powers across all hospitals? Well, then you get a sort of a very small or basically zero price increase, maybe a 1.7% price increase. However, if hospitals now can band together, and if we think bargaining power comes from, let's say, the negotiating team you have, and now that fantastic negotiating team for one hospital can negotiate for all the hospitals, well, you actually now start seeing that there's some price reduction. Right? So it's not the case that always you're going to see prices being reduced when the hospitals can get together. It's maybe a bit more subtle. Right? And again, it's not just about what you assume here, but everything that went into the model that's driving these results. Okay? So what he's going to say is like, look, it seems that because preferences are somewhat heterogeneous across hospitals, that there is a hospital stent-specific preference parameter in the demand system. Maybe we have a world in which uniform pricing is leading to softer price competition. And then really hospitals then, by merging, are only going to be better off if they somehow can increase the bargaining power across all of them to, let's say, the max. Right? And there's some other simulations he does in the paper as well.
Isn't it really strange to assume that it's like, it appears like bargaining power just comes from, like, exogenous, like it comes from nowhere. If all the hospitals band together, they must have they're now giving take it or leave it offers to the suppliers, right? Because how they're the only consumer. They're monopoly, aren't they?
So the question is, I guess, the reasonableness of this. I guess you could have another column where beta H goes to 1 and see what happens under monopsony. Presumably, you get basically more negative results. Again, absent sort of a model for where these bargaining parameters comes from, I agree it's difficult to evaluate the reasonableness of one assumption or another. I think I will say, though, even though hospitals are, no, actually, I'll leave it at that. Okay, I'm happy to talk offline. Yeah, yes.
So I guess I just want to say something that's kind of related to this and also the earlier comments about it being a residual. So I mentioned this briefly, but like if you think about Rubinstein, right? So there, the split is coming from something about there would be time preferences. So it's coming from the impatience that each side has to reach a deal. So on the residual thing, that's not necessarily, if you think of that beta's parameters coming from that, it's not necessarily different than estimating preferences of demand. Right? So it's not just, some random residual. It's, you're trying to explain the data with something that, admittedly, in reduced form, is perhaps capturing something about preferences. Now, whether, it really, thinking about it in terms of time preference or risk aversion or other things is right, I think, is the best explanation for what's driving this is an open question. But, and it also tells you that just because you have one side, one side of the market, it doesn't mean they're making take it or leave it offers to everyone else, right? So, after all, Rubinstein is one-on-one. You don't have both sides making take it or leave it offers to the other, right? So there's something, at least you can think of that as motivating this idea of a split.
Yeah, but then you'd also have to consider monopoly theory, right?
But I don't know, if you take a very simple problem, use a notion like the core, then it would really suggest to you that, so suppose you have two manufacturers, each one of them has one stand, and a hospital, there's just one hospital and one patient. And the stand plus the hospital gives the value to the consumer, then the hospital will take over the service.
That's right. I mean, I guess.
So there are simple theoretical considerations which would suggest, at least in simple
Absolutely.
If
So I
they're
think
perfectly homogeneous.
Yeah.
they're substitutable.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking the simplest.
No, absolutely. So,
simplest possible.
right. You know, I guess in these applied frames, because
By the way,
they're
which is related to another question.
Mhm.
Why? There's no, I mean, the core doesn't identify, the core doesn't identify a single solution.
that's right. Why
So
we
it's extremely relevant. Anyhow.
in allowing? Oh, there's a lot of questions. I guess with the core or others, I mean, in these settings, because they're more complicated, because there's many by many, there's externalities, because we don't want to allow for the possibility of, say, general contracts, maybe side payments among firms on the same side of the industry. Perhaps, we use these solution concepts that restrict attention to maybe the contract forms, let's say, we see in reality, has steered us towards.
Sort of the difficulty with the paper is it hinges on what happens in a counterfactual where we group possibilities together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to depend on the bargaining power, which is going to change in this context.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just not what we're good at analyzing. So the sort of the basic question of the model isn't great at the basic question of the paper. So for this paper,
No, actually, just I would separate out my comment about like the estimation of the bargaining parameters for what we see versus the counterfactual. Right, the counterfactual, I agree. Like,
It's not.
Who is it who's bargaining when they merge
Yeah,
together? Even if you think it's time preferences, right? So.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that's a sort of a fair point. I think one of the contributions of the paper is how do we think about the identification of a bargaining model and why we think standard Nash per trend models may be inadequate to explain the data. Also, one in which we can sort of estimate both marginal costs and bargaining parameters. It's one of the values. And this is sort of a proof of concept, what you could do with a fully estimated model. Perhaps, again, as people have alluded to, there are some limitations or weaknesses in how much in the implementation. But a question?
Yeah, so under this interpretation of the bargaining power, the patient's interpretation, I would expect maybe as a sanity check to see correlations between the estimated bargaining power and some things such as a financial position, maybe, because then it would, or the relative financial positions of the two parties. So I wonder if that would be something interesting to check.
Or
That
inventory.
must be.
Inventories, yeah.
No, I think those are all great suggestions for all the future researchers in the room for potential next projects.
Before you need
Yeah, for any of these stents, that's right. Any other questions on this paper before I move on? Yes?
And another counterfactual might be if FDA, say, approves another stent, how this change market power of existing firms, how much welfare additional stent would be?
Yep. So exactly, one could, the question is, can we use the frame, well, a good application of the framework to evaluate market structure changes, the entry of new products to different layers of the supply chain. That's right. Which is a great segue into the next paper, which attempts to do exactly that in a slightly different setting, although one you've seen this morning that Mike has sort of introduced. Right? So we're going to talk about another paper, written by myself and Kate Ho, that again, let's look at the U.S. healthcare system, sort of a mini healthcare session today. As was discussed, consumers typically access healthcare in the commercial healthcare market via an insurer. And the choice set of insurers is dictated by the exchange or in the state that you live in or by your employer. And that's how generally 60 to 65% of non-elderly consumers in the U.S. obtain their health care. When you go to an insurer, you get access to that insurer's network of providers, hospitals and doctors. And by and large, you want to think of the network as dictating literally where you can or can't go. If he's out of network, you can't go. If he's in network, you can go. Insurers are jointly negotiating networks as well as reimbursement rates. And by and large, with hospitals, you see something close to a per admission price. There are some severity adjustments, but the contracts are very complicated, but they're a per admission price, essentially. Okay. There has been many proposed and implemented changes in insurer competition across markets. We see consolidation that's been proposed. There's a pretty big merger that was blocked by the Department of Justice last year between Anthem and Cigna. And one question is, well, what would happen if you change downstream competition in these types of markets? Right? What happens if insurers merged or insurers exited? In many state exchanges, we've been seeing exit by insurers due to, among other things, uncertainty over the Affordable Care Act, the regulations. Okay.
In the first point, typically offered by employer or exchange. So, what do you mean by exchange?
So in the U.S., some states have set up insurance exchanges that if you don't have insurance offered by your employer, you can access. And this is a marketplace where some insurers have decided to enter and provide insurance plans to consumers.
So, it's equivalent to the private insurance, means that I can go and buy insurance from some
You can buy it directly.
direct.
Yes. Some details being glossed over, but that's how you want to think about it. Yes. Okay.
And so M are the plans and H are
I'm sorry, yes. So we're going to have a bunch of abbreviations both in this paper and the next. M's are oftentimes referred to as MCOs, or managed care organizations. Think of them as insurers. Just a capital I also doesn't work so well for notation, but capital M are insurers. Okay.
H.
Are hospitals.
Okay.
Let's think hospitals and managed care organizations. And let's have the thought experiment of what would happen if you, let's say, reduced insurer competition. Let's say one insurer went out of business or was removed from an employer's choice set. Okay. So in this market, we have a bunch of hospitals. Let's say your employer offers 2 insurers. These hospitals contract with the insurers, and you as a consumer have to choose the best insurer for your families before then choosing a hospital if one of you gets sick. If an insurer is removed, a few things can happen. One is you might now think that because there's fewer downstream firms, downstream prices might go up. These downstream prices are called premiums in this market, and let's denote it as phi. Okay? So if there's reduced insurer competition, premiums may increase. However, because prices to hospitals are negotiated, these are per admission prices, when there's fewer insurers, you might think maybe the insurers have greater bargaining leverage, they can negotiate lower prices, and maybe some of those prices will be passed along to consumers, thereby mitigating premium increases or even offsetting them altogether. Okay? So it's theoretically ambiguous. Plus, there's going to be then subsequent effects on entry, exit, investment, so on and so forth. Outside of this paper, definitely things that we keep saying we need to do and we need to do more of in IO. Okay. All right. That's the motivation. Here's essentially the approach. Maybe it looks a little bit familiar, a little bit more machinery, I guess. It's going to build a model of how hospitals and insurers bargain with one another. It's going to be Nash and Nash. It's also going to add a layer in which insurers no longer can unilaterally set downstream prices to consumers, but rather they must bargain or negotiate with employers over the premiums that are charged. Why is it that this additional stage is sort of introduced? Is because, similar to the intuition from Grennan, we're going to find that the observed premiums are too low, given estimated parameters and data, than would be predicted by a model of unconstrained Nash per tron premium setting. So what we're going to do is build a model of bargaining to help rationalize that observation. Okay? Now, what happens when there's competing insurers, by the way, and how this is different from Grennan, is that when you think about bargaining, upon disagreement, a couple of things happen. Let's say insurer 1 now disagrees with hospital 1. Okay? In Grennan's case, this hospital no longer sold anything. Sorry. This hospital no longer sells anything to the manufacturer and loses, right? But now, because there's downstream competition, if there's disagreement between hospital 1 and M1, maybe downstream consumers will switch over to the other insurer to still access that hospital. Maybe those consumers who live close to that hospital or who really love that hospital. As a result, its disagreement point will change because of this downstream competition. Okay? Furthermore, remember Grennan assumed that hospitals were independent. Here there's going to be downstream competition, so when this insurer loses this hospital, well, how badly or how it fares will depend on what its competitors are doing and the networks and contracts its rivals have signed. Okay. So it differs from Grennan and Garasankaran at all. It's going to be similar to Ali's paper with Greg and another paper in cable television that we'll talk about later. Okay. So we have this sort of supply side model. And then we're also going to build a model of how is it that households choose the best insurance product for their family members, and how is it that consumers choose hospitals. This part essentially adapts what Kate used in her 2009 paper with some tweaks due to our institutional environment or setting. Okay? And then this is the simulation we're going to attempt to sort of run, one in which this large employer that we're focusing on just kicks out one of the major insurers from its choice set. And we're going to assume after that's done, all this kind of is resimulated, and let's see what the counterfactual outcome looks like. So let me come to that in the next slide, so I don't need to repeat the question, but anything here? Okay. Just a little bit of color about the details. What I mean by CalPERS, it's a public agency that manages pension and retirement and health benefits for all state and public agency employees in California. We have data from 2004. For this time period, as well as for the next decade, there really were only 3 major insurance plans that it offered to its beneficiaries. One by Blue Shield, which is an HMO plan, one by Blue Cross, a PPO plan, and one by Kaiser Permanente. These two are about 45% market share each, with this one about 10% or 15% of enrollees. Okay? So these two were the big ones. This is the slightly smaller in terms of enrollment. There's a rich set of data which is going to be used in the various components of the model, okay? Similar to what Kate used in her old paper, but adding particularly the most important thing being what's known as claims data. So for every person who goes to a given medical provider, we see what the procedure was, what provider that person went to, as well as what the insurer paid the provider for that service. So we're actually observing information on the negotiated rates between an insurer and a hospital. And that's going to be critical for actually doing what we need to do. Okay. So that,
Just a question. Institutional question, are the prices paid to the hospital CalPERS specific by Blue Cross, or is it, I guess the
that's
model's going to treat it like it is?
Yes. That's a great question, something that we haven't been able to learn. We know, at least talking to Zach Cooper and his work with Marty Gaynor and Van Reenen, that there is evidence in the HCCI data that they see variation across employers for the same insurer for rates for a given provider. So we know anecdotally there is some evidence of employer-specific pricing for large groups. We know that there are CalPERS-specific plans that are offered, which is also consistent with, well, it may or, yeah. But we don't have evidence to suggest that there is, yeah, any variation at this time period with an insurer across employers.
But I guess it's also a question about the hospital's charges to the plans, about whether they're CalPERS specific.
That's right.
Which also will get treated. Everything's going to get treated as CalPERS specific.
Everyone's treated in this model, yes. Okay. Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay. All right. Just some color. I apologize, the numbers are a little small, but if you want to get a sense of what healthcare premiums looked like in California about a decade ago, a little bit more than that now, what CalPERS did was charge the same premium given a household type and plan. So basically, if you're single and enrolled in Blue Shield, you pay $3,800 per year, and it goes up to $10,000 if you're a family. And I apologize, not that you actually paid this, but that this is the premium that the insurance company received. As an employee, you actually contributed only 20% of that number. Okay? But this kind of requirement that prices only varied within plan across family types is something that's used to estimate premium elasticities later on in the demand system. The insurers vary in the size of their networks, as well as what the prices that are paid. On average, you want to get a sense of magnitudes. If you scale for a severity, you get an average payment of about $7,000 or $6,000 per admission. And with estimates of costs coming from a different data set, we see that the average cost per admission is about $1,600 to $1,700. There's quite a sizable markup that hospitals are being paid. Obviously, hospitals have quite a bit of other businesses as well as fixed costs, so we're not saying anything here. We can't say anything here about hospital profitability. Okay. All right. So here's sort of a. Oh, there's fixed costs. Like this is just a marginal cost estimate per admission. So the fact that there's a markup, we're not saying anything about our hospitals, making a ton of money. All right, so this paper conditions on the set of insurers, the set of hospitals in each market. They also condition on the set of contracting relationships that are observed. What's interesting is that in this particular time period, networks were relatively full in that both Blue Shield and Blue Cross contracted with all major hospital systems in every market. There's one, that third insurer is vertically integrated, Kaiser, and they have their own hospitals. So they're kind of not really negotiating contracts with anybody. They just build their own hospital when they need to. Okay. So for a given network, denoted script G, here's the following timing that's assumed. There's some stage 1 in which a few things happen. First, employers and insurers bargain over premiums, some vector phi, that the employer has to pay, and the employee pays part of that. Simultaneously with this bargaining over premiums, every insurer and hospital that's observed to contract in the data would assume engage in Nash and Nash bargaining to determine some linear per admission price. After this stage 1 concludes, households choose the best insurance product for their families. This determines some demand for insurance product J as a function of the network and premiums. And after that, some individuals become sick with some diagnosis and go to the best hospital that's available to them in their network G. And that determines hospital demand at hospital I on plan J. There's a critical assumption that's kind of buried in here. It's not implicit, but it's sort of made explicit with this functional form here. It says that demand to a given insurer, or rather a demand to a given hospital, does not depend on the vector of negotiated prices. This is motivated by the fact that in CalPERS, for 2 of the 3 plans, there is no co-insurance rate. That is, people do not pay a fraction of the negotiated price. And for another one, we believe at the time period, prices weren't very transparent. It's very difficult for consumers to know what the negotiated prices were. As a result, we believe that their demand does not depend on the actual negotiated wholesale prices, but only on basically their preferences for the underlying hospitals. Okay? This is going to be similar to what we assume in the next paper when we model cable television viewing, that when people choose which channels to view, given they subscribe to Comcast or DirecTV, their viewership decisions aren't affected by the negotiated wholesale prices or affiliate fees, right? So what happens when you have these markets, like in healthcare, where once a consumer joins an insurance plan but can go to any hospital without thinking about the negotiated price, is that there's this sort of externality that's imposed across hospitals now here, right? Where if hospital 1 increases its price, hospital 1 might see lower demand only insofar as premiums have gone up and fewer consumers enroll here. But that also negatively hurts everyone else who's also enrolled in that plan. Okay. Contrast this with, let's say, a retailer manufacturing environment. Let's say there are yogurt guys negotiating with grocery stores. Well, you think that when a yogurt manufacturer increases its price to a grocery store, the grocery store can set a product-specific price on its shelf. And so perhaps that manufacturer is more directly affected by any negotiated price increase. So that's kind of one institutional distinction between these bundled service markets or these option demand markets, okay, just to be aware of.
Wait, so you have here employer, household, and individual, but actually they're all the same thing, right? Like in the model, they are going to be modeled separately?
Yes.
And what's the subscript for each of them?
So the question is, were we modeling employers, households, and individuals separately? The answer is yes here. Subscripts would be hospital I, insurer J. There is no notation here for employer, individual, or household yet. And that's going to come into play when these things are fleshed out. Okay?
So just to clarify,
going to be a response. So just to clarify, that there's no going to be any price response, right? Just a quantity response.
There will be a, so the question is, what kind of response is allowable here if there's a disagreement? In this model, because premiums and price are negotiated simultaneously at once, when there's disagreement, we're going to be holding fixed the premiums and prices, so both downstream and upstream prices. However, because these two stages happen after this, there will be a demand response, a quantity response. So yes, just repeating it for everyone else here. Okay. How many time? So these are the objectives we'll be working with. They're going to be profits for both insurers and hospitals. For a given insurer J, we're going to model its profits as basically coming from how many people enroll in the plan, multiplied by the premium it charges, minus some non-hospital marginal costs to be estimated. These are supposed to represent administrative or physician or drug costs that are not modeled. And here we have basically its payments made to hospitals. So it's going to sum over all hospitals in its network, denoted GJ for the insurer, for MCOs. And for every hospital in its network, some number of people given by this demand function go to that hospital, and the insurer has to pay that hospital the negotiated price. Any fixed costs or anything else that's invariant to the network and contracts will drop out in some subsequent analyses, and it's sort of not given here. For hospitals, its profits are going to be given by basically how many patients does it receive from every insurer N that it contracts with, multiplied by its negotiated price with that insurer minus its constant marginal costs per admission. Okay, so that's sort of the objects that go into the model. Sort of what I'm going to try to do, sort of at a at a high level, is go over these stages and try to just emphasize what's new. There's going to be a lot of details in the next couple slides, which I'm going to gloss over a couple, but hopefully you'll get a flavor of the details, and then I'm going to sort of focus a little bit more time on these two parts here and show how it differs from what we explored with Grennan. Okay. But the hospital demand stage, we go in reverse order. We say, all right, we see an individual who's enrolled in this plan. We want to know how is it that they choose go to hospital A or hospital B. And the reason we spend a lot of time here is because, as I mentioned, it's going to allow us to predict utilization patterns for any arbitrary network. It lets us predict counterfactual demand flows if there's disagreement. And it also allows us to, when we estimate insurer demand, construct an internally consistent measure of hospital network utility. And I'll be more specific as to what I mean by that on the next slide. Yes?
Given that this model, or that in principle you could predict how hospitals would be used for arbitrary networks, couldn't you also look at the question, what if the insurance companies decided to change their networks? You're taking the network for the insurance company as given, right? But they should be optimizing that too.
So the question is, can we do more about endogenizing the choice of the insurer's network? And in this paper, the network is indeed fixed, both for estimation and counterfactuals. There's a subsequent paper that I hopefully will get to in the afternoon that attempts to make some progress towards informing what those networks look like using precisely these inputs. But yes, these inputs could be used to inform profitability of networks that are very different from what we observe. That's correct. Okay. So some people were wondering, how is it that you estimate these demands? What can you include? And a lot of this comes from Kate's earlier paper, where it says, all right, if you're an individual, with some probability you come down with a disease that requires admission. There's some disease you can come down with. It's very coarse, but it's one of these, let's say 6 categories. And given you happen to have this disease, you pick the hospital that maximizes the following utility expression. So individual K derives utility from hospital I, given some diagnosis L. And there's some hospital fixed effect. There's some interaction between the disease and hospital characteristics. So if you have a heart attack, you care if there's not a heart attack, but if you have some coronary disease, you care if there's a catheterization lab. If you're delivering a child, you care if there's a neonatal unit, things like that. One of the most important characteristics to sort of control for, as we find in the literature, is distance. How far are you as a consumer, or rather your zip code, from that particular hospital? And what you can do is estimate this, conditioning on the choice sets that are available to the consumers when making their decisions. Okay. So that's sort of the hospital demand system. This following functional form is basically a logit demand system. It's kind of special because it allows you to do certain things, which include, and I'm jumping to the insurance demand model, but allows you to construct an internally consistent measure of what's the expected utility you would get from having access to some set of hospitals prior to the realization of your disease or even this logit shock. Okay? It's this closed form expression here, which basically weights by the probability you need to get admitted, the probability you come down with the disease, times what's known as this log sum expression. Okay? So what it means is if you estimated your hospital demand system, then for any network of hospitals, you can construct this measure, and maybe we want to use this measure as a characteristic of the insurance product when deciding which insurance product to choose. Okay? So families are going to pick the best insurance product for their members, which is a function of this willingness to pay measure, some insurer market-specific fixed effect, some measure of premiums. And again, what we're trying to do from this demand system is predict now insurance enrollment for any arbitrary hospital network and obtain premium elasticities. Okay, so that's a lot to sort of go over, but that's what the hospital demand system does, is what the insurance demand system does. And now let's talk about the supply side here. Okay. There's two parts of the supply side that this paper talks about. One is determination of upstream prices. The other is the determination of downstream premiums. Okay. With regard to prices, this expression by now should look familiar. It's the Nash and Nash equation. The admission price paid to hospital I given from insurer J satisfies that. What's important here is the paper is assuming that bargaining is conducted simultaneously with premium setting. What that means is when we take the first order condition of this expression with respect to price, we can actually hold fixed premiums because in equilibrium, any slight adjustment to the prices aren't immediately reflected in the premiums. Now in equilibrium, they will be consistent with one another, but at least in terms of sort of deriving the next expression, we can actually hold those premiums as fixed. Okay? And also with Nash and Nash bargaining, you can straightforwardly extend it to allow for like all or nothing bargaining. That is to say there are hospital systems. So you can assume that an insurer negotiates not just with one hospital, with all hospitals in the same system. And if there's disagreement, all of the hospitals in that system get dropped. Right? That's sort of something that's straightforwardly accommodated here. Just to have a little bit of intuition here, what does the theory tell us about what goes into the determination of these payments made to hospitals? So what I've done here is taken the first order condition of the Nash and Nash bargaining problem. On the left-hand side, I've written down total payments made to a hospital. This is the per admission price times the amount of people who go to that hospital in equilibrium. That's just the total payment. What does it equal? Well, the theory says it's going to equal something that's a sum of two things. This first thing is really you can think of as the insurer's gains from trade. The bottom, something reflecting the hospital's gains from trade. What do I mean by that? Well, you multiply by some bargaining parameter, this object here. And what I mean by insurer's gains from trade, he asks, what would happen to the insurer's profits with and without this hospital I? Well, if he dropped hospital I, he would lose some amount of patients, and that's what we write down here as delta ij dj. How many fewer enrollees would he get? You multiply that by the margins he obtains, premiums minus non-hospital costs, which says basically if an insurer drops a hospital and it causes the insurer to lose a lot of patients, this guy is going to be pretty large, which means the hospital is going to be paid more. Right? And that kind of is intuitive. The hospital has no effect on the insurer's demand. Well, we don't expect that hospital to get paid very much. It's not that important to the insurer's profits. This object here says that when we have this environment where there are, I guess, contracting externalities, when there's disagreement between an insurer and a hospital, you have to think about what that insurer is paying other hospitals. And the reason for this is when the insurer drops hospital I, enrollees will divert to other hospitals on the insurer's network. If those other hospitals are paid something really high, that means the insurer is going to be harmed when he drops his hospital. Conversely, if the other hospitals are really cheap, the insurer actually might benefit by dropping this high-priced hospital. So there's this sort of reinforcement effect across the prices that are negotiated. And the cheaper the other hospitals are in your network, the less actually you have to pay this guy, because you benefit by steering people to the cheaper hospitals. Okay? So that's sort of the insurer's gains from trade. We think it's fairly intuitive. Here, the hospital's gains from trade, well, you have to think about how much the hospital has to pay to serve the patients. So the insurer has to pay some of the hospital's marginal costs, weighted by this bargaining parameter. But there's also this opportunity cost that the hospital is foregoing by forming this contract. Why is that? Think about this hospital and this insurer. If this hospital disagreed with the insurer, he might actually get more people to come to him through the rival insurer. And if the rival insurer is paying this hospital a lot, well, the hospital's giving up something by contracting with insurer one. There's an opportunity cost here. So again, it says that there's externalities imposed by contracts formed by other insurers with this hospital. Okay? And so premiums are held fixed due to this simultaneous timing assumption. Now, if you stare at this, it kind of maybe is somewhat intuitive that it's not clear if we remove an insurer from this market, what's going to happen to hospital prices. Because even if you just look at this term here, when there's fewer insurers in a market, you might think insurers now are harmed less when they drop a hospital. There's fewer rivals that consumers can substitute to. Insurers less dependent on a given hospital. That's going to fall. And so you might think prices will go down. But the offsetting effect is what happens to premiums. When there's fewer insurers, you might think premium competition is softened. This guy is going to increase. So just the effect on this term alone, it's not clear ex ante what direction we should see. So that's sort of the first recommendation there. Yes? It will change. So the question is, can we, I guess, learn something about the bargaining parameters from the observed network structure? And the answer is, I believe, yes, and it depends on sort of the details. And I'm gonna maybe we can sort of defer that conversation to the afternoon, where there is information in the network structure that's not being leveraged in this paper and also in other papers that you might think could inform underlying structural primitives. And we'll talk a little bit about how one could do that. But I think that's a very fruitful and promising area to think about. Okay. And just to close the model here, so I talked about these P's. Lastly, how do we think about premiums? More bargaining. What's assumed in this paper is that insurers bargain with the employer over the premium that the insurer J is allowed to charge. How do they bargain? Well, why not assume they bargain according to this particular Nash bargaining problem? And given it's sort of solved simultaneously with upstream bargaining, it's almost now that the insurers are simultaneously bargaining with all hospitals as well as the employer at the same time. So this distinction between upstream and downstream prices in terms of modeling convention is maybe perhaps artificial. And so it's natural to think about, yeah, the insurer is just doing another bargain with the employer now simultaneously with the hospitals. Where the insurer now thinks that his gains from trade with the employer are simply the profits that he realizes from that employer. Now you could go down the rabbit hole or go down sort of a bit deeper and say, well, isn't there competition across employers for employees? Do we think that there's basically people switching jobs to get access to certain providers or certain insurance companies? Perhaps, but that's being abstracted away here from here. Okay. What's the employer doing? Well, we think the employer in this model maximizes underlying employee welfare. This is a way to construct a welfare measure given its enrollees have access to a set of insurance products M or M minus J. You can construct the gains from trade, find what these premiums are that satisfy that, which come from this first order condition. Okay, now, a lot of math here, but essentially it says if this tau phi were 1, and what does that mean? If tau phi were such that the insurer had all the bargaining power with respect to the insurer, with respect to the employer, this second term would drop out, and the first order condition would say the derivative of the insurer's profits with respect to premiums equals 0. That's your standard Bertrand-Nash first order condition. Okay, it's conditioning on the premiums everyone else is charging. The fact that tau phi could be less than 1 indicates that premiums might be lower than the insurer, if it was unconstrained, would want to charge. And it's a function of how much the employer gains from having the additional insurer in its choice set. Okay? And visually, it's probably pretty straightforward. What can be done is with the estimates, as we vary this Nash bargaining parameter over premiums from 0 to 1, we see that the predicted premiums for these insurers increase. Mechanically, you get something close to the Nash, Bertrand-Nash premiums over there. And to construct this graph, you need estimates of the marginal costs facing insurers, and you need estimates of the premium elasticities. What we find here is that premium elasticities are too low, are low, therefore you would predict under Bertrand-Nash very high markups. Okay? But in fact, in the data, we see insurers actually have lower margins and are trying to rationalize that observation by having some intermediate value of this Nash bargaining parameter. Okay?
Is there one employer?
We're modeling as one major employer here. It's about 10% of the commercial insured market in California. It's about 1.2 million covered lives. So it's a fairly large employer.
And you're not going to tell us who it is?
It's CalPERS. It's an organization that manages health benefits for all state and public employees.
So it's the state.
It's essentially the state.
All right.
So we think, have some leverage over insurers, and indeed this evidence suggests that indeed there are these kinds of negotiations going on. All right, so you estimate this thing. Basically, you estimate hospital demand, you estimate insurance demand. How do you estimate the bargaining parameters on hospital costs? Well, you can express predictions of the theory model. Means you can construct what the model
Unfortunately.
Oh, sorry, did it die?
Yeah.
Sure. There are. We can talk a little bit afterwards, but I imagine there are also time assumptions with these. There's a sense in which to do these additional modeling exercises, you would still need to do the other stages that are being modeled here. So you can think of these as modular building blocks towards answering more ambitious and complex questions.
I have a question. I mean, it's sort of vast. You know, you can get markups, you can get, you know, hospital, and you should be able to does it rationalize the fixed costs of the hospital or the fixed costs of the insurer? You should be able to get that from the answers for your.
Oh, and that type of question.
Yeah.
Yes. It's not done here. I don't think.
But that is a sort of a, you know, you might, it's sort of outside the model.
Yep.
Timeline, but does it make sense or not?
Validating the.
External validation.
But that sort of is not model specific if you think you observe prices and costs already. And you know what the profits are for these hospitals. Maybe we can talk about this offline. Just in the interest of
Yeah, go ahead.
getting people to lunch on time. Let me just conclude with 2 slides. If there are takeaways, what's being done here? What's being found in this paper is that premiums typically rise. You can ignore all the numbers in this top column for now. Just basically what the paper does is summarizes its results by looking at what happens when to premiums and hospital prices upon the removal of a small or a large insurer under the model in which the employer can constrain premiums along this bargaining, in this bargaining fashion, okay, in this bargaining, according to this bargaining solution. What we find is that essentially upon the removal of a large insurer, premiums will increase, and hospital prices actually don't change by very much. However, when you remove a small insurer, you find that actually you have maybe the counterintuitive prediction that premiums and prices could actually fall, that the removal of some competitor can actually infer upon the remaining insurers additional bargaining leverage to then bring down prices and pass them along to consumers. However, if you have unconstrained premium setting, we tend to find that premiums always go up. I'm not going to go into here, but there are heterogeneous effects. You remove an insurer, it's not the case that all hospitals are worse off. In some markets, you actually find prices rising for hospitals. In some markets, you find prices lowering. We can go into that, but essentially this is what this paper attempts to do. Okay. After lunch, we'll move to a new industry. This is cable television, and we'll talk about how we can use these models to evaluate the effects of vertical integration. Okay, one last question? The question is, what is the intuition for prices falling? Well, I mean, when one insurer is removed, there's fewer, I guess, the remaining insurers have greater bargaining leverage with respect to the hospitals, right? There's less of a loss of enrollees upon disagreement. If the reduction in prices are sufficiently large, and we find that premiums are sort of constrained in the fashion we've modeled them to be, then you get both prices and premiums falling.
So are we assuming that if one of the insurers falls away, basically their current enrollees will shift over to the other companies, but the bargaining power of those companies not change?
So the model is indeed holding fixed the bargaining parameters, and any adjustments in rates are coming from changes in the disagreement points, or what we call, I guess, bargaining leverage. So depending on our theory for where these bargaining powers come from, if we believe they're a function of size, then perhaps you might think they would adjust. But they're being held fixed here, absolutely. All right, thanks.